The wind rolled off the sea like an ancient song, low and bone-deep. Ivy Sinclair pulled her coat tighter around her frame, though it did little to stop the chill from threading through the worn seams. Her boots were soaked from stepping through puddles along the cobbled streets of Windmere-on-Sea, a small coastal town that had once been lively with tourists, but now stood as tired as she felt. The clouds above sagged heavy with unshed rain, and a mist curled low over the harbor. She hesitated outside Chandler's, a tiny tea shop tucked between a shuttered bookstore and a charity thrift store. The windows were fogged with steam and warmth. Inside, the scent of chamomile and cinnamon drifted through the glass like a whisper. Ivy pressed her fingers to the coins in her coat pocket, barely enough for a small cup of tea. It was all she had. She stepped inside, and the warmth hit her like an embrace she didn't know she needed. The bell chimed softly overhead. Her hands were trembling slightly. From the cold, from hunger, from the exhaustion that came from being constantly uncertain. Ivy took her place at the back of the short line, the old wooden floor creaking beneath her feet. In front of her stood a man in a heavy coat, damp from the drizzle. His boots were scuffed, the soles nearly flapping with wear. His hands, large but calloused, were wrapped around an empty wallet. She watched as he pulled out a few coins, lips pressed thin. "That'll be 2 pounds and 10 pence, the barista said. The man hesitated. I thought I had more," he muttered, fumbling deeper into the pockets of his coat. The line shifted with subtle impatience. Ivy heard someone behind her sigh audibly. The man looked up, apology thick in his eyes. I must have dropped it." Something tugged at Ivy. She didn't pause long enough to debate. She simply stepped forward and said clearly, "I've got it. I'll cover his tea." The barista blinked. The man blinked. "You don't have to," he said, almost shyly. "I know," Ivy replied, offering her handful of change. There was a long silence as the coins clinked against the counter. The man accepted the cup, then turned to look at her. His eyes were dark, tired. But in them, something flickered. "Thank you," he said. "That means more than you might know." Ivy only nodded. "It's just tea." But as he stepped out into the gray mist, she realized something strange. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel quite so invisible. The next morning, Ivy returned to Chandler's, though she had no money left and little reason to be there. The tea shop had become her accidental refuge, a place that smelled like her grandmother's kitchen, and echoed of warmth she'd long forgotten. She slipped inside quietly, hoping to glance at the community board near the washroom. Sometimes there were notices: dog walking, dishwashing, odd jobs, anything that might earn her enough for a loaf of bread. The shop was nearly empty, save for the clatter of cups and the hum of the espresso machine. She was reading a job notice thumbtacked to the board. Evening help needed at the docks. Cash paid nightly, when a voice spoke from behind her. "Still looking for something?" She turned, startled. It was the man from the day before. This time, his coat was drier, and his hair combed back, but his eyes were unmistakable. Ivy blinked. "You again," she said warily. "Did you forget your wallet this time too?" He smiled, the expression crooked and sheepish. "No, I brought it today. Full of real currency, I promise." He hesitated. "I just figured I might get the chance to return the favor." "I didn't do it for a favor," Ivy replied quickly, a slight edge in her voice. "I know," he said, softly now. "That's exactly why it mattered." She studied him for a moment, arms folded. His posture was relaxed, but his presence still felt slightly out of place, like a man pretending to belong in a town he'd only just discovered. "You're not from here?" she said. "No," he admitted. "I came for a bit of quiet, to get away. My name's Victor." "Ivy," she replied after a beat. Victor offered a hand, and when she didn't shake it, he didn't press. Instead, he gestured toward a nearby table. "May I sit with you?" She hesitated, but something about his demeanor wasn't threatening. If anything, it felt curious. Open. "Fine," she said, moving to the small table by the fogged window. "But I can't stay long." Understood, Victor said, settling in across from her. He ordered a pot of Earl Grey and 2 scones, even though she insisted she didn't want anything. You paid for my tea, I insist, he said. Besides, no one should ever talk on an empty stomach. She didn't argue after that. They spoke in slow, tentative exchanges. Victor asked about the town, how long she'd lived here, what she did for work. Ivy told him about the diner that had closed down last spring, about her brief job at the fish market, about the apartment above the flower shop she couldn't afford anymore. Then, almost by accident, she told him about the tea room, the one she used to imagine opening when she was a teenager, a place filled with old books and good lighting, mismatched chairs and walls that smelled of bergamot and lemon cakes. She called it the Lantern Room in her sketches, a name that made her think of warmth and safety. Victor didn't interrupt. He just listened. His gaze didn't drift. His hands didn't fidget. He watched her like someone trying to learn a language through careful observation. When the teapot emptied, Ivy stood to leave. "Thanks for the scone," she said. "Thanks for the tea," he replied. "Yesterday." She gave a small nod and walked out, the chime above the door fading behind her. What she didn't see was the notebook Victor pulled from his coat once she was gone. Slim, leather-bound, with a single phrase written neatly across the top of the page. The girl who gave, even when she had nothing left. Days passed. Ivy didn't expect to see Victor again, but somehow she always did. At first, it felt like coincidence. Once at the harbor's edge, watching the gulls pick at forgotten chips. Another time, near the church where volunteers handed out bowls of soup to anyone who lined up with a bit of dignity still left in their stance. Each time, he greeted her like an old friend, without presumption, just presence. Their conversations were never planned. Ivy rarely stayed long, yet slowly she began to look forward to the sound of his voice. A gentle, measured cadence, as if every word had been considered first, not for cleverness but for kindness. He never asked too many questions. Instead, he let hers unfold, lay a V. One morning, they sat again by the fogged window at Chandler's. Ivy had scraped together enough for a single chamomile tea. Victor had already ordered a second cup for her. She didn't protest this time. "You're not just here to get away, are you?" she asked, staring into the steam rising from her cup. Victor looked out at the rain-slicked street. "No. I'm here because I forgot what made people matter." That wasn't the answer she expected. He leaned back in the chair, watching the drizzle run down the glass. "I spent a long time believing that stories had to be big to be meaningful. Epic journeys, tragedies, triumphs. Then, I burned out. I stopped writing. Stopped caring. I thought I'd lost something permanent." "And now?" she asked. He looked at her. "Now I think I was just looking in the wrong places." The words made Ivy's heart ache in a way she didn't fully understand. There was something different about Victor, a weight behind his words, as though he carried 1,000 unspoken stories in the folds of his coat. Yet he looked at her like she was the one worth remembering. Do her motor. She didn't tell him everything, not yet, but she let more pieces of herself slip through. About her grandmother who used to say hope isn't something you find, it's something you carry. About the journal she filled with pastry recipes and doodles of teacups stacked like castles. About the rejection letters that felt less like paper and more like bruises. About the landlord who didn't knock anymore, just taped notices to the door. Ein sen quogen. She didn't cry when she spoke. But Victor's eyes softened every time, like he was memorizing grief the way others memorized maps. Once, when she handed him a makeshift blueberry muffin she'd baked using leftover flour and borrowed butter, he bit into it with reverence, closed his eyes, and murmured, "This tastes like memory." She laughed, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in weeks. They spent hours like that, sometimes speaking, sometimes just watching the world move past the window. The silence between them was no longer hollow. It had become gentle, the kind that settled around your shoulders like a soft shawl. Then, one day, Ivy asked, "What do you write, Victor?" He paused. "Nothing lately," he replied. She tilted her head. "But you used to?" "A long time ago," he said. "Before the stories stopped feeling true." She nodded, accepting the answer. though a question still lingered in her mind. That night, alone in her small room, Ivy pulled out her old notebook. The pages smelled like dust and ink. She hadn't dared to open it in months. But tonight, something stirred. She flipped to the first page. There was her tea room sketch, the lantern room, with ivy-wrapped windows and candlelit corners. She traced the outline with her finger, and she began to write again. Not because she believed anything would change, but because, for the first time in a long time, she believed someone might be listening. It had been raining for 3 straight days, a slow, steady drizzle that blurred the edges of the town like a watercolor left out in the storm. Ivy didn't mind. Rain gave her permission to hide beneath her hood, to wander unnoticed. On the 4th morning, with a mind full of restless thoughts and a coat pocket holding nothing but lint, she ducked into Whitaker's Used Books, a crooked little shop on the corner of Elm Street. The bookstore smelled of paper and time. Its shelves leaned like old men, heavy with stories. Ivy wasn't there to buy. She rarely was. But sometimes, leafing through worn pages soothed the ache of a day with no purpose. She meandered to the new editions table more out of habit than hope. Her fingers brushed past hardcovers with cracked spines and books with forgotten dedications. Then she saw it. A familiar face stared up at her from the back cover of a navy blue hardback. Sharp cheekbones, tired, intelligent eyes. That faint, crooked smile she'd begun to recognize. Victor. Only the name printed on the dust jacket was Rowan Vale. Her heart gave a stuttered beat. She turned the book over. On the front cover, in gold-embossed letters, read, "The Woman in the Window Light." Below that, by Rowan Vale, author of 7 national bestsellers. Ivy blinked. The air around her thickened. The name, the photo, the way he spoke, how he listened, how he watched. Tom Mullins. It all made sense now. Tom Mullins. Tom Mullins, it all made sense now. Bourse. Her breath quickened. She flipped to the first page. Minimium. And there it was. Chi Ahsby, Zazacha Haktened. A story about a woman in a seaside town who used her last coins to buy a stranger a cup of tea. A woman who dreamed of light, even when surrounded by shadows. A woman who baked blueberry muffins when there was barely enough sugar left in the jar. Her, word for word, memory for memory, her. She let the book fall shut and stared at it like it had betrayed her. That evening, Ivy walked to the small park by the cliff, the one where the gulls circled endlessly and the sea whispered secrets into the rocks. The bench beneath the old cedar tree was empty for a moment. Then he appeared, just as he always had, hands in his coat pockets, a worn notebook tucked under one arm. He smiled when he saw her. "You came." She didn't smile back. She didn't sit. Her voice came low, steady. "Your name's not Victor." He froze. The wind tugged gently at his coat. She stepped forward. "Rowan Vale. Best-selling author. Recluse. Liar." His expression faltered. "Ivy." "You wrote about me," she said, the words brittle. "You turned my life into a story. Did you think I wouldn't find out?" Rowan's voice was quiet. "I didn't mean to hurt you, but you did," she snapped. "You used me. You listened, you watched, and then you wrote me down like I was some kind of metaphor." He stepped closer, cautiously. "I wrote you down because I didn't know how else to remember the moment someone gave without being asked. Someone who mattered not because of what they had, but because of who they were." Ivy's eyes shimmered, not with admiration this time, but with betrayal. "I gave because you looked like you needed help, not because I wanted to be someone's inspiration." "I know," Rowan said. "That's why you were." She shook her head and turned away, the notebook under his arm catching her eye. It looked familiar, pages marked with memories she hadn't even said aloud, moments he must have witnessed when she thought she was alone. "You watched me like I was some story worth stealing," she whispered. Rowan's voice cracked. No, I watched because you were the first truth I'd seen in years. I didn't want to steal anything. I wanted to remember what it looked like when someone was real. Ivy didn't respond. She walked away without another word. And Rowan Vale, once a man made of stories, stood alone with a notebook full of someone else's. The rain hadn't stopped by morning. It whispered against the window panes of Ivy's flat, a single upstairs room above a shuttered dressmaker's shop, where the wallpaper peeled in long strips and the heater wheezed like it was giving its last breath. Ivy sat on the edge of her narrow bed, wrapped in a sweater 2 sizes too big, a cup of cold tea untouched beside her. Her boots were still damp from the night before. She hadn't slept. The book still sat on the desk, spine up, pages marked where she'd slammed it shut. She couldn't bear to open it again, to see her life dressed up in elegant prose, served to the world like it was someone's clever idea of poetry. She felt hollow, exposed. Then, just before noon, as the wind rattled the glass, a soft thump came from the hallway. At first, she ignored it. But something pulled her toward the door. A whisper of intuition, like the flicker of a lantern in fog. Tucked beneath the cracked threshold was an envelope, no stamp, no address, just her name. Ivy. Written in a hand she instantly recognized. Precise, slanted, thoughtful. Her throat tightened. She picked it up, turning it over once before slipping a finger beneath the flap. Inside was a letter, and beneath it, several printed pages bound together loosely. A manuscript. But she didn't touch the pages. Not yet. She read the letter first. Ivy, I told you stories were everything to me. That wasn't the truth. For a long time, I believed the world had enough of them. Too many, maybe. Too much noise. Too much cleverness for the sake of applause. I swore I'd never write again unless I found something worth the silence I'd kept. Then I met you. I didn't know I was watching a story. I thought I was simply being saved by a cup of tea, by a voice that said, "It's just tea," but somehow made it feel like everything. I never intended to turn you into a character. You were never a character. You were the reminder I didn't know I was missing. Pois. I wrote this story, but I haven't shown it to anyone. No publisher, no agent, no one but you. It's yours first, because it's about you, not just what you did, but who you are when no one is looking. If you never want to see me again, I'll understand. But if there's even a small part of you that wonders whether being seen is the same as being used, I hope you'll read what I wrote. Not as proof, not as an apology, but as a thank you, Hi Olen, for waking me up, Hi Olen, for reminding me that kindness is the truest form of courage. Hi Olen, Kai Olen, the Mahai Olen, yours, Kyle. Rowan. Ivy set the letter down, her hands trembling. For a long moment, she simply stared at the manuscript. The cover page read, handwritten in soft ink, "The Girl with the Lantern Heart." She flipped to the first page. It began in a tea shop, on a rainy morning, with a cup of tea paid for by someone who could barely afford her own. But the details weren't just accurate. They were intimate. The way she pinched her sleeves when nervous, the way she looked at cinnamon buns like they were full of memories, the way she laughed like it startled even herself. Rowan hadn't just observed her, then Taida. He had seen her. And he had written not about her poverty or her hardship, but about her light, the quiet, steady kind that flickers even when the wind howls outside. She didn't realize she was crying until a tear fell onto the page. But it wasn't sorrow, not this time. She reached for her coat. It took Ivy 4 blocks to realize she didn't know what she was going to say. The manuscript was clutched tightly under her arm, its edges soft now from being read and reread through a storm of disbelief and quiet wonder. Her heart was thudding like it was trying to outpace her thoughts. The rain had faded to mist, and the air smelled of salt and chimney smoke, a typical Windmere-on-Sea winter. She almost turned back, but something in Rowan's letter had lit a fuse she couldn't extinguish. Not a spark of anger anymore, but something older, warmer, gentler. A memory of being seen and not shamed. Of being written about with reverence, not pity. The address had been scrawled on the back of the envelope. Nothing more than 12 Morrow Lane. She found it nestled at the end of a narrow street, the houses crouched together like old neighbors whispering in the dark. Ivy hesitated in front of the gate, her fingers tightening on the wrought iron. There were no lights on the street, but from the windows of number 12, a soft golden glow spilled through gauzy curtains. Somewhere inside, a kettle whistled. She stepped forward. The front door was slightly ajar, not carelessly, but as if someone had hoped she might come. She pushed it open. The scent hit her first: cinnamon, nutmeg, and something sweet melting in butter. Her stomach growled involuntarily. It smelled like memory. "Hello?" she called softly. No reply, just the clink of a spoon against ceramic. She followed the warmth through a narrow hallway lined with books and photos. Black and white snapshots, a framed newspaper article, a postcard of a bakery in Paris. The walls were the color of faded parchment. Everything about the home felt lived in, quietly treasured. The kitchen was modest, but inviting. Wooden beams, a worn table, a vase of dried lavender, and at the stove stood Rowan. Not the elusive author, not the quiet observer, just a man in a flour-dusted apron squinting at the oven timer like it was judging his life choices. He turned. For a moment he didn't speak, just looked at her, eyes wide, unsure. "Ivy," he breathed. "You remembered the cinnamon," she said softly. "I remembered everything," he replied. He gestured awkwardly to the counter. "I tried your grandmother's pecan bread recipe. You once said she measured love by the pinch, not the cup." Ivy raised an eyebrow, stepping closer. "And you tried to recreate that?" "I needed to do something while I waited," Rowan admitted. "I hoped you'd come." She studied him. Not the clothes or the setting, but the way he held himself. There was no arrogance, no performance, just a man who had written something honest and didn't know what to do with the consequences. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" "Because I wanted to know what it felt like to be helped without being someone important." He placed 2 mismatched plates on the table, slices of warm pecan bread gently steaming. They sat, not opposite each other like adversaries, but beside each other, like people sharing something unspoken. The bread was imperfect, slightly overbaked, but Ivy ate it anyway, because it had been made for her, not to impress but to remember. "No more lies," Rowan said finally. "I've had enough fiction." Ivy looked at him, eyes searching. "I didn't mean to be your story." "You weren't," he said. "You were the reason I wanted to tell one again." She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. After a moment, she reached into her coat and placed the manuscript on the table between them. I want to help finish it," she said. He blinked. "You do?" "But not just about me," Ivy continued. "There are so many people like me. People who give, who dream quietly, who go unseen. We write their stories, together." Rowan exhaled, the beginning of something fragile in his chest unfolding. "Ordinary people with extraordinary hearts," he murmured. Ivy nodded. "We remind the world they still exist." The "For Rent" sign had been in the window for months. A narrow storefront near the corner of Norwell and Hart, with faded blue trim and chipped window panes. Once a clock repair shop, then a florist, it now sat dormant, the kind of place people passed without noticing. But Ivy had noticed. She had walked past it countless times, imagining what it could be if someone simply believed in the quiet potential of forgotten things. 3 weeks after the kitchen conversation, she unlocked the door for the first time. The bell above it gave a tired jingle, and dust motes swirled in the sunlight that cut across the hardwood floor. It smelled like old glue and time. Ivy smiled. Behind her, Rowan carried in a crate of secondhand books, the titles worn but loved. He looked around at the cracked walls and scuffed counters with a kind of wonder Ivy had only ever seen in children or men who had spent too long inside their own heads. "This place," he said, "already feels like a story." She looked at him over her shoulder. "It's about to become one." They painted the walls with colors that made people feel warm even when it rained. Lemon white, dusty rose, seafoam green. Ivy hand-lettered quotes above the windows in chalk. "Kindness doesn't ask for attention. It just shows up anyway." The name went up 2 weeks later, carved into a simple wooden sign above the door. The Lantern Room. Part tea house, part bookshop, all heart. It opened quietly, on a Thursday morning in early March. There were no influencers, no press, just the smell of scones baking in the back and 2 paper signs taped to the front window. Free tea for anyone who needs it. Books are for sharing. Take one, leave one, or just enjoy. The first customer was a woman with a stroller and tear-stained cheeks. Ivy didn't ask what she was going through. She simply poured her a cup of chamomile, slid a lemon scone onto a napkin, and pointed toward the cozy armchair by the window. More people came. A retired teacher who had no one left to read to. A boy who skipped school but devoured chapter books. A teenager who asked to help wash dishes in exchange for a warm muffin. And Rowan, always Rowan, sitting in the corner with a notebook in his lap, quietly chronicling the way goodness stitched itself back into the world. Dathash, they didn't call it charity. They called it community. Every other Friday, they hosted storytelling nights. No microphones, no stage, just people gathered around mismatched chairs, sharing stories that were too soft for the internet, too tender for applause. Ivy read once, a short piece she'd written about the day she almost gave up, and the cup of tea that changed everything. There was a silence when she finished, and then quiet clapping, and then a hug from a stranger that lingered just long enough to feel like healing. A month later, The Girl with the Lantern Heart hit the shelves. The title was modest, the cover was simple, but the pages held truth. It wasn't a bestseller overnight, and it didn't need to be. It found its way into libraries and little free book boxes, into shelters and waiting rooms and overstuffed tote bags. It was dog-eared, passed between friends, and read aloud at dinner tables. In time, people began to ask, "Who is Ivy Sinclair?" But the answer was never fame. It was light. Quiet, steady light. One rainy afternoon, a child looked up from a book and asked her, "Miss Ivy, what's a lantern heart?" She knelt beside him and said, "It means you carry hope, even when it's dark, especially then." Outside, the mist curled along the streets. Inside, the tea house glowed. Winter returned to Windmere-on-Sea like a familiar sigh. Snow dusted the sidewalks in gentle hushes, settling over windowsills and clinging to the eaves of the lantern room like powdered sugar. Inside, warmth bloomed, not just from the oven or the kettle, but from the rhythm of something rare, belonging. It was after hours now. The last customers had left, their laughter trailing out into the quiet street. The chairs were stacked, lights dimmed, and Ivy stood at the long counter, icing a cake with careful, unhurried strokes. Vanilla sponge, whipped cream, a swirl of caramel in the shape of a small heart. Simple, but intentional, just like him. Rowan arrived exactly when she knew he would, the tiny bell above the back door giving a gentle chime as he stepped in, brushing snow from his shoulders. He stopped in the doorway, eyebrows rising as he took in the candles flickering along the windowsill, the scent of vanilla, and the quiet hum of an old jazz record playing in the background. Ivy turned, apron still dusted with flour. "Happy birthday," she said softly. "Nowhere." He blinked, surprised. "You remembered?" She smiled. "I always remember the people who remember me." He crossed the room slowly, gaze lingering on the cake. "That's the first time someone's baked me a cake in 20 years at least." "Well," she said, slicing 2 small pieces, "you've earned it." They sat at the kitchen table, the same one where they'd scribbled edits on manuscript pages and jotted names of characters they'd met in real life. Tonight, though, there were no notebooks, just 2 plates, 2 forks, and the quiet gravity of something unspoken waiting to surface. Rowan took a bite. Closed his eyes. "Perfect," he murmured. Ivy didn't reply. She only watched him, her fingers idly tracing the edge of her teacup. He set his fork down after a few bites, and his voice came lower, steadier. "All my life I've written about love," he said. "I've shaped it in sentences, polished it into pages. I've given it every word I could find." Ivy looked up, heart stilled. "But I think I only just started to live it." She didn't move, didn't blink, she only listened. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small velvet pouch. No box, no shine, just something old and quiet and sincere. He opened it gently, revealing a ring, thin, worn, with a tiny pearl nestled in its aged setting. "This belonged to my mother," he said. "She gave it to me when I was 18 and told me not to part with it until I found someone with a lantern heart. Someone who gives without needing to be seen, who loves not for recognition but because they can't help it." He looked into Ivy's eyes. She didn't say it had to be someone grand, just someone true. He held out the ring. "Ivy, would you stay? Not just in this place, but in this life. With me?" The silence that followed was not hesitation. It was wait. The kind that lives between people who already know the answer. Ivy's voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been staying," she said. "I just didn't know it had a name." She took the ring and slid it onto her own finger. No applause. No grand declarations. Just two hands and the soft certainty that this was what home felt like. They sat in silence for a while after that, watching the snow fall outside the window. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang the hour. Rowan reached across the table and touched her hand, thumb brushing gently against her palm. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For lighting the way back to myself." Ivy smiled, soft and steady. "We're not finished," she whispered. "No," he agreed. "We're just beginning." Spring arrived not with fanfare, but with a quiet unfolding. Crocuses pushed through the damp soil outside the lantern room, and the salty breeze off the sea carried hints of something warmer, something new. The narrow streets of Windmere-on-Sea shook off their winter hush, and in the shop windows, paper blossoms began to appear. Inside the tea house, the world moved softly. Children ran through the door with coins clutched in mittened hands, asking for lemon tarts. Retired sailors read poetry aloud in hushed tones. Teenagers traded dog-eared novels and stories from home. The walls smelled of cardamom and conversation, the light catching the dust in golden threads. And in the corner, always the corner, sat Rowan Vale, no longer a recluse, no longer a man in hiding. Just a man in a wool sweater, a notebook open before him, and a mug of Earl Grey steaming by his hand. Most knew him simply as Mr. Mo, short for More Stories, the nickname given by a 7-year-old who hadn't remembered his real name. He never corrected her. When someone asked, "Aren't you Rowan Vale, the writer?" he'd smile, gesture toward the counter, and say, "The story started with her." Ivy stood behind that counter nearly every day, her apron forever dusted with flour, her cheeks always flushed from ovens and laughter. The pearl ring never left her hand, and above her, carved into the wooden beam just below the ceiling, was a simple phrase that Rowan had burned in himself. "Kindness never runs out." They didn't advertise their book, The Girl with the Lantern Heart. It didn't need it. Book clubs passed it hand to hand. Teachers read chapters aloud in schools. Shelters stocked it on their welcome shelves. Libraries tucked it near the checkout desk with a handwritten note that read, "Read this when the world feels heavy." People left notes inside. "You reminded me of my mother. I paid for someone's coffee today. Thank you for writing something real." One evening during a storytelling night, a little girl stood on a chair to speak. Her voice was shy but bright. "My mom paid for someone's groceries last week," she said. "She said it made her heart feel bigger." Everyone clapped. Ivy didn't say anything, just wiped her eyes and smiled. That night, as Rowan and Ivy locked the shop and stepped into the cool spring air, they paused at the edge of the street. She looked up at him. "Do you miss the fame?" He shook his head. "No, I used to chase readers. Now I live beside the only one who ever truly understood the story." They stood together for a moment, hand in hand, steam curling from the paper cups they carried. No cameras, no headlines. Just the sound of children laughing in the distance, the scent of fresh scones wafting from a nearby window, and the glow of the lantern room behind them, steady, inviting, unchanged. Rowan looked at Ivy, at the woman who gave when she had nothing, who had stitched something extraordinary from the ordinary, who had reminded him that a single act of kindness can become an entire life. "This," he whispered, "is the best chapter I've ever written." Ivy leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice as soft as the sky above them. We didn't write it alone. If this story moved you, reminded you that healing is real, or renewed your belief in second chances, we invite you to subscribe to Healing Stories. Here, we share real-life journeys of strength, love, and hope. Stories that speak straight to the soul. Thank you for being here. And always remember, no matter how far you fall, there's always a way back to the light. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let us know.